All right. So I wanted to start by saying that this presentation, first of all, is not mine alone. It's based on the praxis of a community of about 5 staff and 70-odd high judgment volunteers that work in congregational development in the Anglican Diocese of Toronto, where until the end of October, I was the director. So that's where this comes from. And to say that I'm not an academic, I'm a consultant, I'm a technician. This is not an academic paper. It's based on observations and phenomena from a community of people working with about 230 congregations in the Greater Toronto Area. Next. Many of you will recognize those booklets. They're now out of print, although they were available as free PDFs because they were so popular. Arlen Rothage, who was one of the founders of the Alban Institute, wrote a book in the early 80s, 1983, called Sizing Up Your Congregation for New Member Ministry. And that was the first documentation of congregational size typology. It was further developed by people like Alice Mann and Beth Geddes, and it was the lifeblood of congregational development theory in the 90s and the early 2000s. Next. Just really quickly, just to review, because there are probably some people in the room who haven't got a clue what I'm talking about. So, size typology is an authority model. It's important to note that because many people think it's a numeric model. But it's about how authority works in congregations. Authority being defined as the ability to make things happen, and perhaps more significantly, the ability to stop things from happening. Most of us have experience of that. Next. The initial book grouped congregations into 4 distinct models, 4 distinct size. And you can see family, pastoral, program, and corporate. Some of the later work proposed that, Kirk Hathaway proposed that there was a transitional size. Some of us argued, no, that wasn't a size typology, that was a dysfunction. And then the reality of resource churches as we grappled with what does megachurch mean. One of the things to note is that this really is culturally bound. It's about primarily North American parishes and Protestant. You go into ethnic congregations that are non-European, non-white, and the numbers all fall apart. The authority structures are different. So for mainline Protestantism in North America, this is fairly accurate and descriptive, or at least it was. Next. Really quickly to go through, the family-sized church, most often typified by a rural parish of less than 50 people on a Sunday morning, single cell, group-centered. The authority is vested in the patriarchs and matriarchs, who are the ones who continue the community and continue its story. The pastor is a chaplain. When they have fights, they fight like families, right? Next. Often a history of short pastorates, strong lay leadership. That's what keeps these places alive. Lack of investment in relationship to the clergy. Most of you know this model of church. It's very familiar. Next. The pastoral sized church, 1 priest, one congregation, 1 building. It shifts. The power shifts from the lay matriarch and patriarch to the pastor. If the pastor's not in the room, it's not going to happen. So what that means is that the mission and ministry of that parish is very dependent on the gifts and passions of the priest. If the priest is passionate about outreach, the parish is going to do outreach. If the priest is a passionate liturgist, they're going to be known for their liturgy. And people affiliate around that. And when they have a fight, they don't fight like family, they fight over the pastor, right? Ask Donna or Elaine how many letters they get complaining about pastors from pastoral-sized parishes. Next. We have the program-sized parish, multi-cell, multi-staffed, group-centered. It's impossible to know everybody's name in a parish of over 150 people. There's that magic and tipping point. He talks about the 150 number as a magic number in sociology. And new member incorporation is not so much in the pastoral size, you were incorporated into a relationship with the pastor. In the family size, you were adopted into the family. In this one, you become part of one of the groups. So, you're part of the Tuesday morning Bible study, or you're part of the choir, or you're part of, that's where your identifier was. The rector's the administrator, and what the fights are is often the various program centers fighting over diminishing resources. Next. And then there's the resource size, where the rector is essentially a CEO, huge program, huge budgets. We had a couple of these in the Diocese of Toronto that had a larger staff than the diocese did. The Cathedral and St. Paul's Bloor Street, places like that. They call them resource-sized churches because they have the resources they need and they're self-generative. Next. Next. Oh, backup one, sorry. So the question is, 35 years later, does this still work? There's a lot changed since the late 70s, early 80s when they were writing this stuff. Next. So one of the things we started to note is that average Sunday attendance is a problem. Because when the press is talking about the decline of the church in Canada, they talk about how only 18% of the population or something goes to church every Sunday. How many of you go to church every Sunday? And you're pastors, okay? The Church of England and the work they did around mission-shaped church redefined the way they kept the statistics. And they started to talk about regular attenders being 12 times a year or more. You got somebody who's coming once a month or more, they're a core member of your congregation. So we started to look at what does it mean for core actives? What does core active mean? In our context, we found that we don't collect that stat, but we found that it was analogous to Easter attendance. Next. So one of the problems with congregational size typology is built in the assumption that one can grow a congregation from one size to the next. And that's what we should be doing. We should all be growing, right? Well, I think the environmental movement and economics have taught us that this sort of slavish dedication to growth as the only model is problematic. So we have many congregations in the Diocese of Toronto who've maintained that same size, some of them for 120 years. Are they growing? I'd say yeah, because there's been a lot of funerals and there's been a lot of people move away and they're still the same size. So does healthy congregational growth necessarily mean that you have to grow from being 150 to 230? No, because that's going to change the entire culture of your congregation. And the people who are coming are not going to be people who want to stick around. So try this on for size. Next slide. We began to do some looking at our statistics, and we think that what we are seeing is what I call stable state churches. There are three basic sizes of stable state church. Next. This one looks a lot like the small country church. 30 to 50 core active folks, looks like 15 to 25 on a Sunday. Often now they're led by bivocational, part-time, shared clergy or lay people. They are in stable sites, the building isn't crippling them, and they've got out from underneath the biggest cost, which is clergy leadership, which means that their resources increasingly are available for mission. And we're seeing this permeate into the urban areas now as well. Next. Then we have what we call the neighborhood church, which is about 175 core active. There are all kinds of these that have been maintaining this size for decades in the Greater Toronto area. They have a full-time priest, often some lay part-time support. They're usually in a visible site. They're well established in their neighborhoods. People can get there. Next. And lastly, we borrowed this term, the resource church, which is the size above that can start to generate the economics that allow for extra program, extra staff, that kind of thing. Again, about 300 plus core active. There aren't a lot of them. And I'm going to stop because the next stuff is all just stats. Go through. Keep going. Okay. The key point. We've allowed economics to define mission and congregational health. The reality of declining population and changes in religious participation means that local churches have increasingly been shut down because they are not economic, against that model of having a full-time cleric and a building. The conversation is shifting. What would it look like if mission forced a rewriting of the economics of local ministry? Next slide. I didn't print off copies of these slides. If you'd like them, that's my email address. Thank you.